Well, last week we started a series called Find Rest. And rest is something so foundationally basic for us, something so instinctual for us that oftentimes we just overlook the thought of rest and we don't put much time into thinking about it. And so we started talking about rest and we went all the way back to the beginning, to the creation story where God created rest. When He chose to rest on the seventh day, God created rest. And it's not something that necessarily He had to do because He's God and He probably didn't need rest, but it's something that He chose to do because in creation, God designed us for rest. And we see that we were made in God's image. And so that means that we were made to reflect the nature of God. And so if God chose to rest, it's something that we should probably choose to do as well. And it's not just something that we do to reflect the nature of God. It's something that really God designed in nature itself. We see that He created day and night so that we would know that we are supposed to rest, right? Our bodies tell us that we need to rest. There's not something that we had to learn. It's not something that someone had to teach us, but our bodies just knew we were designed to rest. And then when God got around to later handing out the law, He also prioritized rest for us because He made rest really part of His law. He really made it one of the 10 commandments, one of the 10 laws that would guide His people for centuries. And He said in the fourth commandment that on the Sabbath day we were instructed to rest. So once every 7 days we should take not just rest as in sleep, but a day just to allow our bodies to relax and to recover. And if you really jump over into the New Testament as well, this is something that Jesus continues these principles where He goes to rest and then He encourages disciples and the people that He is leading to take time to find rest. And actually we get to this point where Jesus offers rest to people. And we talked about all those things. What we discovered was that we are the best version of ourselves when we are rested. We're the best version of ourselves when we are rested. We feel better, we perform better, we think more clearly when we're rested, and we interact with other people better as well. When we're not rested, we don't tend to be as kind or forgiving or patient. We tend to interact not quite as well with others when we aren't rested. And all of us, I know what's true about all of us is we all want to be the best version of ourselves. And in a perfect world, we would all be perfectly rested, right? But it's not that easy. Life complicates things. Life is complicated. There are things that require our attention. There are things that require our attention really at inconvenient times. Maybe it's being sick or a sick spouse or a sick child that you have to take care of, and all of a sudden your rest is a little out of balance. There are responsibilities that we have that demand of us that sometimes take away from our rest. There's recreation that we have that sometimes devours our rest, right? Sometimes we stay up late to hang out with friends or watch that game or binge watch that show, right? And sometimes we're getting ready to go to bed and we just pick up our phone to scroll through social media when we get tired. And an hour later, we're just caught up in this vicious, never-ending news feed cycle of what our friends have going on in their lives, right? For whatever reason, whyever the case is, sometimes rest can be difficult to find. Sometimes rest can be difficult to find, and really more so just than staying up a little later than you meant to, right? Sometimes we are legitimately trying to find rest, but for whatever reason, it just doesn't end up being restful for us, right? So, because rest is more than just a physical pause. Sometimes rest can actually be the opposite of a physical pause. Maybe you are in a job that is sort of isolated or very stationary, not very physically demanding, or maybe it's just your personality that when you wrap up your job or what seems to recharge you or energize you is not taking a break when you're done with the day, right? It's not restful to do that. Instead, What's more restful for you is to get around people, or to maybe even go exercise, to hike a trail or ride your bike, or find a sport that you can play. And it's not physically resting, but those are the types of things that give you energy, that seem to restore your spirits a little bit. And going home at the end of the day and just sitting down would actually be more draining for you than restful. Because rest really can be difficult to find. And time away doesn't always equate to rest. Some jobs are as simple as just leaving, clocking out, leaving the office, leaving the job site, and then you can walk away and you can turn that off and you're done, right? And for some of you, that's exactly what you need. You need some time off. You need some time away, a time to break and not have to think about it, to unwind, leave your job, and then not have to think about it until you have to go back. Some of you are really and truly able to find rest from at least your job when you go home, when you just take some time off. But for some people, that seems nearly impossible. You can't imagine even taking time off without creating this avalanche of disaster that would follow, right? Whether you work by yourself or whether you work with a team, somehow taking time off creates more work instead of less work. And if really we're completely honest, there are some people out there, and even I probably feel this way sometimes, is when you leave your place of employment, when you leave your job, that is when the real work begins, because your job sometimes can actually be an escape from the realities of life that it's throwing at you, right? And there's all kinds of reasons that this can be true, right? Sometimes there's a strained relationship at home. Maybe there's financial struggles at home. Maybe if you're like me, your kids are just at the age where when you get home and just life is happening, you just ask yourself, where did I go wrong? And when can I ever help make it better, right? Sometimes going home is just trading out the job that you get paid for the job that you don't, right? There's grass to be cut, there's dishes to be washed, laundry needs done, rooms need cleaned, dinner needs to be cooked. Your calendar has every night on it full, sometimes multiple things on the same night, and that can go on for months. And to top it all off, your list of home improvements is continuing to get longer and longer. There is no time for rest. And even if you did stop to do nothing, your mind is constantly consumed with all of the things that you should be doing. And so it's just hard to find rest when there is this feeling that there is still so much you need to do. And really, rest affects more than just how tired we are, right? Rest affects, it's not just about our physical well-being. Rest is about our spiritual well-being as well. And God knew that rest was more than just having to slow down every once in a while. In order to find true rest, right? There's something that deeper that has to occur. And so last week we ended with this invitation from Jesus, and this is where we're going to pick up again this week. He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you Ambien." If you're one of the more naturopathic people, melatonin, maybe that's more your speed, right? No, Jesus was addressing something that could not just be satisfied by being slept off, right? He knew there was something deeper that was affecting the people that he was talking to. So he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest," but a different kind of rest than they maybe understood he was talking about at first. This word weary, we talked about it last week. That's just the idea of being tired. Not just tired, really extremely tired, exhausted. Being weary is you are tired of being tired, right? That's a whole another level. But then he uses this word burdened. And if you look at that word a little bit more, burdened, or some translations say heavy laden, that is a word that oftentimes is used to describe something different than physical rest. The Greek word used is fortizo, and it means not just this physical burden, but a spiritual burden, maybe this heavy weight that looms over you spiritually. And really, if you look at it, up until Jesus showed up, all they had in their spiritual system was the Mosaic law and the temple system. And those were extremely demanding. There was this long list of rituals and festivals and sacrifices, and then they added all of these extra rules on top of that. And really, as a person following God, you had no direct access to God. Really, you depended on a priest to do that. And so if you did encounter sin in your life, there was no just dealing with it in private. You had to publicly go to a priest to take care of it, right? And depending on what sin it was, there were different laws that told you what the sacrifice is that you had to take to that priest so that he could make that sacrifice on your behalf, right? And then if you slipped up, if you found yourself doing something that you shouldn't have, again, you're just on the hook until you can find time to make it back to that priest and they can make a sacrifice for your sins, right? This system was very complex. It was very demanding. The system was very burdensome. And the burden was only made worse by the spiritual leaders of the day. And in fact, Jesus would later warn people about those spiritual leaders. He says this: they tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. And if you look at this word loads, it's actually that same word from the last one, just the noun form. So it's fortion instead of fortizo, and it's the same burden, this cumbersome load, or this cumbersome burden, this heavy weight. And then Jesus pairs it with this word cumbersome, which if you look at it, those two words together just are specifically addressing these precepts or these laws that are hard to carry, that are heavy to obey. Really, the word implies that they're irksome to people, that they're not helpful. They're more of a hindrance to people, right? And what happened with these leaders is they created all of these extra spiritual laws. They took God's law and they looked at it and they said, you know what? This isn't good enough by itself. We're going to need to help people out. So we're going to create all of these other laws to help people from slipping on God's laws. And so it would be like if you were driving down the road and the speed limit said 40 miles an hour, then somebody came along and said, you know, I know that says 40, but let's go 20 instead because, you know, I know it'll take a lot longer to get there. It'll be harder, but we just want to stay as far away from that 40 as possible. And so over time, they just developed more and more laws to push people further and further away from breaking God's law, which of course is well intended, right? But God's law was something designed to help people travel on the right path. And as they continue to add all these extra laws and restrictions and tell people what they couldn't do, really it just slowed them up and it tripped them up and it made it really too heavy to even move or make any progress, right? And so with the heaviness of that system, of that religious system in mind, Jesus says this. He says, come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Right? All of the effort you've put with your labors, all of the effort you've put with your struggles, only to feel like you're still not good enough. Always to feel like there's always something more to do. Come to me, and I will give you rest. Bring that weight to me. He goes on to say this: take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. And that word yoke is kind of a dated term. If you're from my generation, the only reason we know about the word yoke is because it was a necessary part of winning the game Oregon Trail. You had to buy lots of yoke for your oxen, right? I don't know, today how many people are familiar with that term. You know, it's kind of an agricultural term. It's the idea of that you would have this tool that you would hook up a beast of burden, whether it's oxen or cows or horses or donkeys, whatever, and it deals with really that specific thing that you place on their neck that would carry the weight of whatever it is that they were pulling. And often when animals were yoked, they were yoked together, and there would be two of them in a pair, and one would be the older, more mature animal, and one would be a younger, sort of hadn't figured it out, maybe almost resentful that they were having to do this. And so eventually, as they're paired together, the young animal learns from the older animal. And they sort of figure out what's going on and how to pull that load and how to be calm in the midst of doing it. And so what Jesus is saying is take your yoke, take your weight, and pair it with me. Learn from me because I'm gentle, I'm humble of heart. I'm not like the Pharisees that are going around adding all this extra weight, being proud of what they're doing, sort of elevating themselves and doing nothing to you but showing you how far you have to come. He says, I'm gentle, I'm humble. Yoke yourself with me. My heart is to help you, not to weigh you down. And when you do, you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. This was an invitation that Jesus made that came with a promise, not about physical rest, but about spiritual rest, rest for their souls, because they had been under this law and this system that was burdensome, that really worked against them, and it weighed them down with this heavy burden. There was really no resolution to it ever. It was impossible to keep the law and to continuously keep the law, and they were always on the hook for something else. There was always something more they had to do to keep their right standing with God. They had this never-ending to-do list to make sure that they had favor with God. And Jesus comes along, and for the first time ever, he says, look, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. I want to come put an end to all of that weight. It says not because of what you do, not because of what you carry and the effort you put forth, but because who you are tied to, because you tie yourself to Jesus. And so Jesus would offer rest like never before. And really what he's doing is he's foreshadowing what would happen when he dies on the cross. Really, he bears the weight of our sin, the full weight of our sin, and he fulfills the requirements of the law once and for all, and he brings this finality to what we have to do. And we have no more burdens that we would have to bear because he on the cross bore it for us. And for the first time, he offers this rest that could be final, that there would be nothing else to do on top of it but tie yourself to Jesus, but put your trust in Jesus. And so he foreshadows that as he's talking to these people. But even before the cross, Jesus begins to challenge the system that creates these weights, that creates these burdens for people. Here's what happens next in the story. It says, at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. We talked about the Sabbath a lot last week, how it's a day of rest, and that word really just means rest. It says his disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. And at this point, there were people watching their every move wherever they were going. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees continually followed Jesus around because they didn't like what Jesus was doing. They didn't like that so many people were following him. They didn't like a lot of the things that he was teaching. And so they constantly tried to challenge his authority in order for them to keep their own authority. And they wanted everyone to know that they didn't agree with what Jesus was doing. They were against the thing he was doing. So they would continually challenge his actions, challenge his authority, really in an attempt to trap him doing something wrong. They wanted to publicize everything that they were against. And this type of behavior really has followed the church for centuries. And it's one of the reasons behind that phrase that you often hear around here, for Thomasville. When we say that we are for Thomasville, this is not just a catchy phrase, not just a catchy logo that we can put on hats or mugs or shirts or cars. Right? It's sort of this motto that stands at the heart of what we want to do as a church. And it's this thought that for far too long, the church has been known for what it's against. And as a church, we want to be known for what we are for and for who we are for. Our primary intention is not to go around slapping people on the wrist and telling them everything that they're doing wrong, right? Our primary intention is to show people the love of their Heavenly Father. Because we believe that God is for the people of Thomasville and the surrounding areas, and that God loves the people of Thomasville and the surrounding areas. And so we want to be for them, and we want to love them, and we want to demonstrate that love to our community. And so what the Pharisees could have done instead is they could have gone and said, hey, Jesus, you know what? We noticed your disciples were hungry and didn't have anything to eat. Can we just give them something to eat so that they don't have to pick these grains? Like, just come on, we'll give them something to eat. But instead, they chose to just speak out against it and simply leave it at that. They simply pointed out the problem, told them they were wrong, and left them without a solution. And so the interesting thing is there's not actually a specific law against doing what it was that the disciples did. This was just the Pharisees' interpretation of the law, that what they were doing looked a little bit too much like work for their liking, and so it was unlawful in their eyes. And so because they chose to challenge Jesus, Jesus decided to challenge them back. He answered, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? Now, Jesus was a master of verbal defense. And instead of answering questions, many times he chose to ask another question, really that reshaped the conversation and cut to the heart of what it was he was being questioned on. And so we went to this familiar story for the Pharisees. They would certainly know this story. And he says, hey, you remember David, right? He's kind of a big deal, national hero, top 3 kings easily, if not the top king in Israel, right? Do you remember what it was that David did, before he was a king, when he was still a fugitive, right? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. But he said David and his men, they took the bread that was baked for God on the Sabbath, the bread that only priests are supposed to eat, and they ate it. And the priests gave it to them to eat. Come on, Pharisees, you remember this story, how the priests did that. And in fact, speaking of priests, haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? The priests themselves, the very law that tells us to rest on the Sabbath, is the same law that forces the priests to work on the Sabbath. So how does that work out, right? Why aren't you checking with them? Or is it maybe that you only come against the people that you don't like? You only harass people that you don't necessarily agree with. And then Jesus makes this claim. He says, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. All these talks of priests and Sabbath and bread and the temple, right? You're willing to make exceptions when it comes to those things. But the temple is just a building. The temple is just somewhere that God shows up occasionally. I want to let you in on this little secret. God is no longer confined to a tent. God is no longer isolated inside of a room. God, Jesus would say, is living among people. You see, Jesus made God accessible to the world and to the people of the world in a way that the temple never could. He goes on to say this, if you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. He says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. There's this phrase that he borrows from the Old Testament prophet Hosea. I desire mercy, not just mercy in the sense of relenting punishment, but compassionate mercy, kindness towards the afflicted, kindness towards the hurting, and a willingness to do something about it. God said there's no better demonstration of his character than to help someone in need. And the point Jesus was trying to make to the Pharisees was this: our lives should help others come closer to God rather than demonstrate their distance from him. Again, our lives should help others come closer to God rather than demonstrate their distance from him. See, the Pharisees, they were all about condemning people, all about pointing out what they were doing wrong, all about calling out their failures. And they used the law really as a weapon to cut people down rather than a tool to help build people up. And God says, hey, rather than demonstrating my love, you're choosing to dictate my law to people. And that's not how it should be. That's not how we should present God and demonstrate God and show God's love to others. And Mark's account of this same story, he includes a statement that's not found in Matthew. He says, then Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. This whole concept of rest, it was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. You're missing the entire point. You're walking around like Sabbath hall monitors, right? Trying to catch someone doing wrong on the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for the good of man. Man was not made for the good of the Sabbath. It was meant to benefit people, not something to berate people with. And then really, he says something next that really gets the Pharisees wound up. He says, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And this title, Son of Man, he borrows it from the Old Testament prophet Daniel. And when he says this, the Pharisees would have been outraged. They would have been disgusted, because it's one thing to challenge their authority, but it's a whole other thing to claim the authority of God. And with this statement, calling himself the Son of Man, saying that he is Lord of the Sabbath, in that Jesus was claiming to be God, to claim to have authority over the Sabbath that God created and that God instituted, was the same thing as to claim the same authority that God had, to claim that he was equal to God. And so he shook them all up, and then he wasn't done yet, so he continued traveling. It says, going on from that place, he went into their synagogue. Synagogue was the local place of Jewish worship and teaching, and it's almost as if Jesus was looking for trouble. All right, and now that the Pharisees thought maybe, hey, we've got home court advantage on this one, let's try to get them again with something, right? It says that a man with a shriveled hand was there, looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus. They, the Pharisees, asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So here we go again with this question of, is it lawful to do something on the Sabbath? And again, this wasn't one of God's laws. It was really, this law in question was a rabbinic decree that came up that forbid the practice of medicine on the Sabbath. Because in ancient medicine, often you would have to take these herbs and these roots, and you'd have to grind them up, which looks a whole lot like work, before you could give someone some medicine. And so in order to uphold God's law of not working, the rabbi at some point made this decree that, hey, you can't really give out medicine on the Sabbath. You can't practice medicine. I mean, if it's life-threatening, that's okay. But other than that, like, they're just going to have to suffer through the day. It was forbidden to practice medicine on the Sabbath. You see, this law, this rule, had great consideration for God's law. Like, hey, let's do this in order to keep God's law even better, right? But it had no consideration for God's people. And in this specific case, with this man with a shriveled hand, the interesting thing is that the Pharisees would assume that his shriveled hand was the result of sin in his life, or maybe in his parents' life, but something happened. Someone acted outside of God's will and outside of his law, and that's what resulted in this shriveled hand to begin with. That this person was a living example of what happens when you break God's law. And really, if you're not a Jesus follower, this may be one of the reasons why, right? You maybe showed up looking for compassion, showed up looking for love, or just showed up curious about Jesus and who he was. And instead of finding any of those things, what you found was that you were looked down upon, that you were judged, that you were not accepted, and it's all because you didn't measure up to this standard that you never asked for, that you weren't keeping rules that you never subscribed to, right? And if I had experienced that, if I had lived what you have lived, I might come to the same conclusion that maybe this following Jesus thing isn't for me. Right? I'd probably have reason to pause too. But that is not how Jesus responded to people. That is not how Jesus treated people. In fact, he challenged the Pharisees in this. Look what happens next. He said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out?" Again, he takes their question about what's lawful on the Sabbath, and he asks this question of them. Hey, if you have this sheep, if you have something of value to you, and it falls into a pit on the wrong day, the Sabbath day, right? And there's a good chance that it's going to die, would you not go and lift it out of the pit? Would you not be willing to do a little bit of work, rescue it, to save it, and really to benefit yourself? Of course you would. Of course you would rescue. How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Jesus says, you place more value on a sheep than you do a person. You place more value on an animal than you do humans. You're willing to bend the law if it benefits yourself, if it protects you from loss, but you don't allow anything that benefits other people. So to answer your question, in fact, let's not just answer this question. Let's answer a lot of the questions that you're going to have. Is it lawful to do this on the Sabbath? Fill in the blank. Is it lawful to blank? The answer is, it is always right to do good. It's always right to do good. It doesn't matter if it's the seventh day or the third day. It is always right to love your neighbor. You seem to have forgotten this whole part of the law that talks about loving your neighbor, that God's not just concerned with you, He's concerned with everyone and their well-being as well, right? They had forgotten that God cares for other people and not just their holy religious group. Because the Sabbath was made for rest. So if someone gets sick on the Sabbath, how much rest are they getting, right? This small amount of medicine could make their day so much more restful for them. Doesn't that seem like that would honor God, that if you just, made them some medicine in a few moments, the rest of their day would be more restful? Is it really better to let someone suffer? And since you brought it up, and now it would just be rude not to address it. Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. Jesus Jesus chose to heal the man on the Sabbath, much to the frustration of the Pharisees. In fact, the next verse would tell us that the Pharisees, after this, they went out to plot how they could kill Jesus because they did not like what he was doing. They did not like what he was saying. But the man with the healed hand, I would imagine that that day, he experienced a different kind of rest, a deeper kind of rest than he had ever experienced before, because he experienced the rest that comes from knowing that God is for him. And Jesus was making good on his promise. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Not just physical rest, but spiritual rest. God offers rest from spiritual burdens, right? The burdens that we think that maybe will never measure up, will never be good enough, that there's always more to do, that we must continually earn God's favor. Jesus said, no. All you have to do is be willing to trust me, to join with me, to pair with me. And you can find rest from all of that. So imagine the relief that can come from knowing that God has already taken care of everything, that he loves you regardless, and that he has already taken the weight of your burden and bore it himself. And right, some of you don't have to imagine that. Some of you have experienced that for yourselves, but from time to time, for whatever reason, we still just try to shoulder some of that load alone, and we just, we think, hey, you know what, God, I got this one. I'll take care of this one. You don't really have to deal with that, whether it's just feeling like you're supposed to do something, or maybe not wanting God to see that part of it. Right? When we feel all of that weight, like there's something more that we have to do, all we have to remember is that if we pair ourselves with Jesus, if we've tied ourselves to Jesus, there's not a weight that we have to carry. Imagine the difference that a church that believed this and then lived this out in its community could make, right? A church that focuses on demonstrating God's love for people rather than just pointing out their flaws. A church where people could belong before they believe, right? A church that was truly for everyone because God is for everyone, regardless of what's in their past, what's in their present, or where they think their future is going. That is the kind of church that Jesus came to start. That's the kind of church that we desire to be, and we won't always get it right, but we should continue to strive for that. And that is a movement that Jesus started so that people could truly find rest. Now, before we go, there's a few discussion questions you can take with you and answer them over lunch or with your small group. Question number 1, when is it that you have the hardest time finding rest? What do you think causes that? Number 2, read Matthew 11:28-30. Is it easy for you to hand over all of your burdens to God? Are there times you feel like you are trying to earn favor with God? What might be the cause, if so? And number 3, what is your biggest barrier to finding rest? What role do others play in your experience? And how can you encourage others to find rest? Let's pray. God, thank you for who you are, the fact that you love us, God, and that you didn't leave us to have to fend for ourselves, God. You didn't leave us wondering where we stand with you, God, but you sent Jesus to offer us rest so that we could have confidence, knowing that you love us and that you are willing to take on whatever it is that we give to you. God, thank you that we can find rest in you even when we're not comfortable with it, even when we don't necessarily completely understand it or believe it. God, just help us to be reminded that we can trust you with that. God, and then just help us. Help us to reflect that in the way that we live so that others see that for themselves as well. God, that we wouldn't be people who come off judgy. God, that we wouldn't be people who just shake their finger at people, God, but we would be people who encourage others to love you and to hand over whatever it is that they're going through to you as well, because whatever it is, you're willing to take that on. God, we thank you and we love you. In your name we pray.